strictly speaking, on the basis of Greek, the normal rules of Greek, what we know about the way Greeks spoke about divine equality, Philippians 2:6 must be talking about some kind of God-equal manner. But then the question is, God-equal manner of what? And here the plot thickens, and here it gets, in fact, maybe more difficult, because in the Greek, the adverbial phrase isotheo does not qualify a regular Greek indicative. The Greek could have said something like, Christ reckoned on the God-equal manner of thinking, or the God-equal manner of loving. But instead, and here the Greek seems really weird, the line uses an infinitive of the verb to be.
Right.
Toenai, being. And the word toenai here, the expression toenai, being here, is the kind of being in the sentence, English sentence, the mystic sat cross-legged meditating on the nature of being. So I call this sense of the Greek word being the absolute existentialist sense.
Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is the one and only Dr. Crispin Fletcher-Louis. He works at the University of Gloucester, where he's primarily doing research work as well as supervising PhD students. Crispin has also worked and taught at several other schools in the UK. He's done church planting work, a lot of different stuff. He's a founder of Westminster Theological Center in the UK, where he was principal until 2012. So he's done a lot of really cool stuff within the academy and outside. He is an internationally recognized authority on early Christology. He wrote on Christology and angelology in Luke Acts for his PhD. He's done some other really interesting work in the Dead Sea Scrolls. His current major project is called Jesus Monotheism. As in 4-volume work where he's kind of laying out the origins of Christology and of high Christology. The book that we're going to be discussing today, this massive tome right here, is something that he kind of bumped into in his larger project and thought that it was really important to work on. This is the title of the book is The Divine Heart Set, Paul's Philippian Christ Hymn, Metaphysical Affections and Civic Virtues. So he thought it was going to be one chapter in this project, and it turned into a massive book. The largest book written on the Christ hymn in Philippians, which is a really important piece for early Christology. So lots to get into here. Crispin's proposal is bold, it's groundbreaking, and lots of huge implications if he's right. So I'm really excited about this book, excited to chat with him about it. And for those that in the know or even not, I think you're going to sense that there's something really important going on here. This is a conversation you're going to pay attention to. If you're interested in picking up this book, link in the description, also a link to the website and the larger Jesus Monotheism project. So definitely want to check this out. Crispin's doing some important work. If you're new to the podcast, please do make sure that you're following us, subscribe to us. If you could leave us a rating and review, that would be fantastic. If you're watching on YouTube, wonderful, on the Center for Bible Study channel. If you've been watching us for any time, please do, if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed. Leave us comments, likes. That helps push this out to more people that might be interested in the kind of stuff that we're doing. And lastly, if you're interested in supporting our work, please do consider becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. That gets you access to all of our classes, past catalog classes and future coming classes. So if you're interested in Bible theology, there's no reading, no writing required. We're not offering a degree, but we are putting out classes on a regular basis with myself and other Bible scholars that might be of interest to you. So check us out. We appreciate it. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Crispin. All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Really just excited to have on Dr. Crispin Fletcher-Louis. We're discussing his really important new monograph. Right, I've got it right here, The Divine Heart Set. And Crispin, really excited to have this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Max.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's been too long since got to really sit down and have a good chat with you, outside of conferences, right? It's been
Yeah,
a while.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. Hey, just so our audience can get a little bit of a chance to know you, yeah, and you can be as long or short as you'd like, but just a bit of your background and your journey into biblical studies and kind of what currently animates your work.
Yeah, okay. So I've never really been anything other than a biblical scholar, at least since leaving school, age 18, when I went to study theology at Oxford.
Hmm.
And I was there at a good time. You were taught by Tom Wright
Yeah.
at the PhD level.
He
Yeah.
actually, so he was not my supervisor. I was his
Oh,
research assistant.
okay. Yeah.
Elizabeth Shively was my supervisor.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Tom taught me when I was an undergraduate, and I was captivated by what he was doing. I studied theology because I wanted to get to the bottom of some big questions about the meaning of life. And I wanted to make a difference in the world, and I thought I could perhaps do that through studying theology. And I'd been a Christian since about the age of 13.
Hmm.
And Tom gave me a kind of model, set an example of what might be possible, as he's done for many of us. I think I probably, at undergraduate level, enjoyed systematics as much, or maybe more than Bible. But I thought
that's interesting.
I
Generally, there's like a fork in the road between those two.
Yeah, well, very recently, I think I've come back to doctrine systematics a bit more. But I just thought I wasn't clever enough to do that, and I thought I could blag my way into New Testament scholarship. So I chose that path, and I figured out that Christology was a really important central question, and that I perhaps could say some interesting things about that. And I've been with that as my primary focus for the last 30 years.
Yeah. Can you just briefly mention, because you've been doing a lot of work on this, and you can even see a little bit of an evolution from your dissertation onwards, but
yeah,
you've been on this for a while, and you've really been kind of a pioneer, I would say, in focusing on the forms of anthropology in early Judaism and its relevance for Christology, and trying to bridge what sometimes is divided, often divided in cross disciplines, which is the nature of how humanity and divinity intersect and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, you don't have to say a lot, but if you just want to speak a little bit to what you've been doing in some of your other projects as well, I think people would be interested.
Yeah, I think I probably am best known for trying to argue that a certain kind of theological anthropology had a more important role for the development of beliefs about Jesus than has normally been acknowledged. Mm-hmm. And that's got me into some trouble, I think, at times. But more recently, I mean, with this book we're going to talk about today, The Divine Heart Set, that doesn't really figure very prominently at all. And I kind of I start in the very beginning in the introduction with a confession. How does it go? I was wrong. I apologize, everyone. I was wrong. I thought the Christ hymn in Philippians was all about
Adam,
contrast between Christ and Adam, and I realized fairly early on into the project that actually that contrast is not as important as a whole generation of us had thought.
Yeah. To be fair, that was the prevailing view for like Dunn and I think Wright, even in when you were coming up, kind of, right.
So, yeah. So I do have a bigger project, and this book is a spin-off from the main project, which is projected to be a 4-volume attempt to offer a new explanation for the origins of the belief in Jesus' divine identity. The key points being that it goes back to Jesus himself. He had an incarnational self-understanding, and we can understand how that would make sense even for a first century Jew. But the Philippians hymn is a kind of key part of the argument, and I think it was going to be a 15,000 word chapter in volume 2, and it's turned out to be
Biggest, what is this? This has got to be the biggest monograph on the Philippians hymn.
I think it probably is, yeah. I mean, it's just shy of 500,000 words. There we go.
So your larger project, just for those that don't know, it's called Jesus Monotheism. And,
that's right. Yeah.
And
so the first volume came out in 2015.
Yep.
I've been trying to finish volume 2, but haven't been able to do that until I finished this monograph on Philippians. So the next thing to do is to get back to Jesus Monotheism volume 2.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll look forward to that. All right, so the book, it's about the Philippians hymn. This is, for those that are aware, this is Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, right? And I guess maybe a good place to start would just be a bit of background in terms of the scholarship. So in terms of like how modern scholars have tried to understand the hymn and some of the common cultural frames that are brought into interpreting the hymn. Could you take us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important question. But because the hymn doesn't, although it has a narrative that looks like it's more or less maps onto the structure of the story of Christ that you have in the Gospels, coming from heaven, life on earth as a human, death on a cross, some kind of exaltation, resurrection, and then return. The way the story is told doesn't use the kind of language you might expect if you came to it from the synoptics or from John even. Mm-hmm. And so that's really created a bit of a puzzle. And so in the 20th century, 21st century, scholars have tried to search for some other kind of cultural framework to explain it as a key to what's going on, especially since it's an early text. Mm-hmm. Depending on when you date Philippians, either early 60s or maybe early 50s even. And it has this very clear structure of Christ being in heaven, coming to earth as a human being. So incarnation, something like that, if that's the right word. How do we explain that? And I think the main contenders there have been a dozen maybe different possible proposed keys. Some of them are completely out of fashion, quite rightly. So Gnostic Redeemer myth, nobody advocates that anymore, though it was popular 50 years ago. Today, probably the three contenders are Adam's, something to do with Adam and Christ, mm-hmm. though that's less common than it was. So a contrast between Christ and Adam driving the story. More recently, people have advocated an angel Christology or an angelomorphic Christology. Mm-hmm.
So kind of like another divine being lower than the high God that comes down.
I mean, the problem with that is that it tends to take you down the line of some kind of Arianism where, you've got he's God, but he's not fully God. But maybe the idea of him receiving the name above all names in the second half of the passage, people think that relates to Exodus 23, 20 to 21, where the
angel, receives the name. Yeah.
And even being in the form of God, it's been suggested in verse 6 that's angel language. Mm-hmm. And then the other contender currently is something to do with Christ over against the emperor or a divine ruler, a divine king, maybe. Mm. That's also probably that's the front runner for the mm-hmm. Interpretive grids that are proposed, historical interpretive grids that are proposed.
Yeah.
In the book, in the first chapter, I kind of go through those mm-hmm. first couple of chapters, and I think the angel Christology has no mileage whatsoever. Mm-hmm. In this case, there's a bit of a contrast between Adam and Christ, but nothing like as significant as we all thought it was. And there's also something to be said for the contrast with the ruler, with the emperor. But mm-hmm. again, I don't think that's really the key.
Yeah. Well, and if we were going to point out some issues with each of these, it seems like one with the ruler one that would be quite different is that you never have I mean, you can have the apotheosis of a ruler, but
Yeah.
the starting out in the form of God is not something we find
Exactly.
with any emperors or divine kings or anything like that, right?
Yeah, that's key. So there are a few texts where the living king, maybe Caligula, for example,
Sure,
tries to imitate or takes on the form of God, but only in their life, at a moment in their life.
right.
So the idea of the of Christ being in the form of God from the beginning, from outside of history, before he comes to earth, that doesn't have a parallel, as far as we know, anywhere in the in the constellation of ideas that sometimes circulated around exalted rulers.
So you need some. I mean, the idea of a life before life on earth, you need some kind of heavenly existence. You have to postulate something. And as you said, the angel one you don't find persuasive. I mean, maybe could you just talk briefly about that? Like, what do you think?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, the two main arguments, as I mentioned a moment ago, are this idea that form of God might be angelic language, and there's one passage in Philo where he does use form language in relation to a scriptural text that's talking about angels, but it's really statistically insignificant. And actually, when you do some hard graph work on the language in the hymn, it's far more likely that form of God here is being used with reference to Greek and Roman language for how God or the gods are in their heavenly state. I mean, it's just form of God is conventional language for the proper form of a particular god. You know, what's Zeus's form, what's Aphrodite's form. Would that's the world that language evokes. There's nothing really in the rest of the letter to the Philippians or in the hymn that suggests it's angel language. And I think it's a mistake to think that in the second half of chapter 2, the giving of the name is really anything like what happens with the name-bearing angel in Exodus 23 to 21.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's helpful. So it's really a question. If it's kind of talking about some kind of divine form, then the question is, what kind of divine form is it talking about, right? And that's kind of what you get into in your argument. And I'll just say, for those that really love primary sources, part of the reason why this book is so long is because Crispin takes you through a lot of primary sources, which is it's really helpful. I mean, it shows, it walks you through a lot of these texts that you have to work through when you're doing this sort of work. Okay, so we talked about this already a little bit off air, but this is I think a huge linchpin of the argument. How you're reading the early part of the hymn, not just the form language, so en morphe theou, huparkon, being in form of God, but also how you are taking this infinitival clause to ena isa theo, often translated, I think, something like. He not considering, and then this equality with God, something to be grasped. You have a different translation of this, a different understanding of this phrase, which is really critical to your understanding of what Paul is saying about Christ in his pre-incarnational state. So I know this is a big topic, multiple chapters in the book. I think you had published also if I'm not mistaken, an article in JTS on this. So, I'll just hand it over to you. Can you walk us through what is going on in this in verse 6? And you can leave out. We'll separate off the harpagmon, that facet. We'll get to that in a minute. But in terms of what is being asserted here, what can you tell us?
Okay, well. Your Greek is better than mine, Max. So you might need to jump in at any point where you think I'm being too quick or not being clear enough. So the usual translation of Philippians 2:6, the first verse, is something like, "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God, harpagmon, whatever. We'll leave the harpagmon for the moment." Now, the key thing here to realize off the bat is that equality with God language is Greek. It's not Jewish. It's not scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
The Old Testament sometimes uses language of likeness to God, or Adam is the image of God. But this equality language is distinctive of the Greek world. It goes back to Homer, and it became especially important after Alexander the Great. And the two words God and equality appear in several different configurations in the Greek texts. They used the expression equality with God in some form is used especially for exalted divine rulers, kings, emperors.
Yep.
And it's most commonly used in a technical expression, God equal honors, isatheoi timai, to describe the practice of directing cultic acts to a human ruler. Specifically, that is the kind of acts that a polytheist or pagan would normally give to a god or to a goddess. So God equal honors would include such things as sacrifice, singing of a hymn, worshipful prostration, acclamation. And some have recognized this. The recognition of that Greek background and its association with rulers has been around for a few decades now.
Yeah.
And it's usually taken to support the idea that what you have with this equality with God idea is in the hymn is a status that Christ either had a status as equal with God from the beginning of the story, or that he chose not to grasp after one, but he received it after his death and exaltation.
Yeah, and that's an important point just for everybody who's not as familiar with the arguments. That understanding is pretty much the majority consensus, or has been, that you're pushing back against. That equality with God equals a positional status that he's either he chooses to relinquish or that he chooses not to grasp after, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think if you look to the most recent translations in English, you'd find that's probably become the default explanation of the Greek here. But in the Greek, the divine equality expression in this text is peculiar, and there are reasons to think it cannot be simply mapped onto the common notion of honors equal to those given to the gods. For example, the text doesn't mention the word honors either or honor, the verb, that don't appear here. And in Philippians 2:6, the divine equality probably describes Christ before he comes to earth, which isn't a natural sphere or state within which you would or you wouldn't receive honors from human beings. Christ is in heaven, and there are no texts where anyone, a god or human being, receives honors equal to God in heaven. The idea doesn't make sense. The idea of honors equal to God makes sense when you're talking about a ruler on earth being given the same kind of cultic veneration that you would give to a god. And in fact, the usual translation, equality with God, is itself problematic and, in fact, almost certainly impossible. If equality with God is what the Greek was trying to say, it would have used an adjective or a noun, where, in fact, the word that is normally translated equality is an adverb. So, strictly speaking, it should be translated something like in an equal manner. Or in equal mode. Now, when I started working on Philippians 2, this really bugged me, that either the commentators ignore the adverbial syntax, or they try to explain it away. And I was really puzzled as to why no one really took it very seriously. And then I went away and did lots of hard work on all the available evidence from the Greek texts that have come down to us. And I discovered that, in fact, this adverbial construction, although it's very rarely attested, is really important because it's found in Homer in books 5 and 21 of the Iliad, where it means exactly what you'd expect it to mean. It means something along the lines of behaving in a way that is the way the gods behave. So the hero Diomedes in Iliad book 5 tries to fight like a god. in a God-equal manner,
Mm-hmm.
and in attacking Aphrodite and then Apollo. So, strictly speaking, on the basis of Greek, the normal rules of Greek, what we know about the way Greeks spoke about divine equality, Philippians 2:6 must be talking about some kind of God-equal manner. But then the question is, God-equal manner of what? And here the plot thickens, and here it gets in fact maybe more difficult, because in the Greek the adverbial phrase isotheo does not qualify a regular Greek indicative. The Greek could have said something like, Christ reckoned on the God-equal manner of thinking, or the God-equal manner of loving. But instead, and here the Greek seems really weird, the line uses an infinitive of the verb to be.
Right.
To enai, being. And the word to enai here, the expression to enai, being here, is the kind of being in the sentence, English sentence, the mystic sat cross-legged meditating on the nature of being. So I call this sense of the Greek word being the absolute existentialist sense.
Okay.
It's not being in the English sense of, we might say something like, being the cleverest girl in her class, she came top in the exam. So that's you can see how that's a different sense of the word being in English. And there's an equivalent in Greek. Now, this verse here is the only place in Paul where he uses this to enai in the absolute existentialist sense of the word. He doesn't use it as in the English sentence, the girl being the cleverest girl in the class. So what's going on? And now there are two keys to the puzzle about the being that is in a manner equal with God. The first thing you need to know. I hope this is making sense, Max. Does it make sense to you? Hopefully, if it makes sense to you, it makes sense to other people.
I'm following. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're suggesting that it's an infinitive construction, and you have the article plus the infinitive, and you're reading it as an existential being. Like he didn't consider. So that part of the challenge, everybody, is that with the Greek grammar is the main verb here is consider. So Jesus or Christ is the subject, and what is he considering? He's considering being in a God equal manner. Like that's what's being considered. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So the being is the object of that verb of considering.
Right.
So why would you talk about something? Why would you talk a being upon which you would reckon or consider? Well, there are two things which help unlock the puzzle here. The first is to know that in the ancient Greek language, the verb to be had a wider range of meaning than is the case with the English verb to be. So eimi or enai could include the sense of to live or to be alive or to dwell, to be present. So we could actually translate this line in 2:6. Christ reckoned to live in a manner equal with God, not harpagmos. But of course, there was another way that a Greek would normally speak about to live, zao. And then actually, when we read on in the rest of the hymn, we realize there's probably good reason that Paul has consciously chosen to speak about a divine kind or manner of being. In Paul's day, there was one place you would not be surprised to find mention of this kind of absolute existentialist being, and that's in a philosophical work. And in philosophy, from well before Socrates and Plato, but especially in those two, there was a great deal of interest in being. If you were a philosopher of any pedigree, you'd probably have a view on the nature of being, of what is. And being was traditionally contrasted with becoming,
right.
Gnomenos or ginomai. In Socrates and Plato, being refers to the divine realm of what is unchanging, unsuffering, stable, and what can be truly perceived by the intellect. And becoming denotes the realm of change, decay, death, instability, mere opinion. Now, as it turns out, as we read on in the hymn, this being-becoming contrast is actually present in a quite prominent way in the hymn.
Mm-hmm.
So Christ, who being in the form of God, considered the God-equal manner of being, not Harpagmos, whatever that is, but rather emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, becoming gnomenos in human likeness.
Mm-hmm.
So Christ makes a journey from this divine being, or this divine like God equal, divine equal mode of being, to become a human in an act of becoming. So the hymn tells a story, I think, of incarnation, as we've later come to call it, using the language of philosophy, using
Mm-hmm.
this common philosophical koine, this philosophical shorthand to speak about different realms of reality.
Mm-hmm.
The divine realm being the human contingent, messy reality that we all inhabit, the realm of becoming. Now, why it does that could take us the rest of the hour. But is that so okay so far?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just coming into
yeah.
Land.
Yeah, that sounds
That'll
good.
make sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so very briefly, I think I would then say a couple of things that don't take too much reflection. The hymn emphatically affirms what Socrates and Plato denied. For those two, divine being does not become. It cannot. God or the gods do not enter the realm of human mortality, and they certainly don't die on the cross. For the hymn, for Paul the Christ believer, divine being has become in the life and death of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So the hymn's making an extraordinary statement that would have baffled or offended the philosophers, but it does so in a way using their language that means it claims for the gospel a kind of philosophical pedigree. Mm-hmm. It says the incarnation can be expressed in philosophical language, which is remarkable because I mean the textbooks normally say, don't they, that it's only in the 2nd century that Christian thought leaders began to articulate their beliefs about Jesus in the language of philosophy. Whereas if I'm right in my reading of Philippians 2, already in the mid 1st century, we've got somebody endorsed by Paul, perhaps by Paul himself, using this philosophical framework and language to articulate their beliefs about Jesus. Very, very close to the Christ event.
Yeah. No, I mean I think that's one of the big bombshells of your book and your argument is that we have in the mid 1st century, if your reading is correct, we have in the mid 1st century a pretty profound philosophical articulation of Christ's pre-incarnate. And of course, I mean, maybe this shouldn't be that surprising. You can think about the opening of John's gospel as well. You can think about Hebrews chapter 1 as well, that there's some mileage here. I mean, I was just teaching a class on Hebrews, and Hebrews also begins with this language of being state, and then the coming and what Christ does, and then you get the exaltation scene where he's recognized as God the Father as Lord. Lord, in the beginning, Lord, you founded the heavens and the earth. That's the Father speaking to the Son there. So yeah. I mean, it's not that. Not, I guess it's not something we're often told is found in Paul. I guess, but it also, I mean, it also really paves the way for drawing continuity in ways that maybe haven't always been seen between what we have in Paul and what we could call, later Trinitarian theology or something like that, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I mean, because
it's kind of using ontological language or nature language,
right. I'm even thinking something like Richard Bauckham, who wanted to get away from ontological language in some ways in his book on divine identity. So to speak in terms of identity, you kind of, if I'm not mistaken, in your book, you kind of merge those two. You use the divine identity language, but also speak in terms of ontology. Yeah,
I think we do need to, at least with this text, bring ontology into the picture. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, this is big stuff. do you want to bring in then the Harpagmon term as well and speak to that?
Yeah.
Because that's also, that's also another. Is it novel? I mean, I haven't. Has anyone else? I think you mentioned one other scholar, right, Fredrickson, who brought in this stuff. But this term is also very, very interesting. Long translation history here, but in terms of the frame that you see here, it has a Oh, go ahead. I'll just hand it over to you. Take it away. What do you think about this?
Okay. So the problem is the word harpagmos does not occur in any Greek text that we know comes from before Paul. So we have a few texts, Plutarch, an astrological text as well from the 2nd century. And then, of course, we have the Greek fathers who cite the verse and comment on it. So there's a long history of interpretation, trying to fathom what the word means. And the strange thing is that until myself and David Fredrickson, everybody seems to ignore what the word means in those 2 or 3 other 2nd century non-Christian passages. And I think actually that's where we should start.
Yeah.
And when we do, although at first it seems very, very odd that the word could have the meaning that it has there, actually it makes a lot of sense. So in Plutarch and the astrological text is Vicious Valens, and also in one manuscript of Pausanias's description of Greece, the word harpagmos means kidnap marriage. So, or as I translate it in this passage, bride napping. Mm-hmm. So this is a problem this is a phenomenon which thankfully doesn't really happen much today, at least not in the Western world, but it does happen still in parts of the world today. If I want to marry somebody and they are spurning my advances, or their father won't let me marry them, their daughter, I just go and kidnap them. Maybe I get together with some guy friends and we strong arm them into marriage. We kidnap them, and then we've got a priest ready and waiting to go through the ceremony, and we force them to go through the ceremony. And it seems to be in the case that at various times and places this was a legally recognized, though unusual or not entirely acceptable, socially acceptable, legally acceptable way to form a marriage union. Obviously, if you have sex with a woman and she produces children, then there are reasons why you might say, well, you would just have to let it be. So kidnap marriage, and so I think what's happening here is that the hymn is saying that Christ reckoned that the God mode of living, the God mode of being, was not to engage in kidnap marriage. Mm-hmm. So why
would he say that?
Yeah. Why on earth would he say that? I mean, it makes no sense. It's completely. It has no kind of pastoral or theological purchase in our world, but it would have done in the world that Paul's writing to, for several reasons. So, first of all, the gods engage in that kind of behavior. The pagan gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, even the female gods, that they're all prone to seeing somebody that they fancy, disguising themselves in human form or in some other form, and most often raping the victim. Mm-hmm. But on a few occasions, whisking them away, abducting them, and marrying them. So a famous example is Zeus transforms himself into the form of a bull, and seduces Europa, the beautiful maiden Europa, and he abducts her, takes her across the sea, and then they settle and have a family. So Harpagmos. Mm-hmm. Dionysus does the same thing with Ariadne. And we have one text, as I mentioned earlier, that describes a picture in which Dionysus abducts Ariadne as a Harpagmos.
Mm.
So I think the first point of contrast here is between Christ and these pagan gods and their predatory sexual behavior, their sexual violence, their deception. They're using disguise as a means of deception. You know, they are the ancient catfishers.
Yeah. So is it kind of like, I mean, would you say one sense or one part of the subtext then is that this divine mode of being is completely different to all the other god myths that you know about, kind of thing?
Yeah.
Is that...
Well, but not completely, because this verse introduces a passage which actually uses the language of the gods. It's similar to what the gods do in their transformations. We talked earlier on, didn't we, about how Christ becomes. So a standard word to describe this or that god entering the human realm, coming from Mount Olympus to mingle with humans, the standard word would be gnomenos, would be become.
Yeah.
So the hymn kind of has to, it's treading a careful line between saying that those myths, those Greek myths, we can use their language up to a point to describe what happened at the incarnation. But we're going to be really, really careful to make clear that what happened with Christ was nothing like the sexual predation motivation that drove the gods in those myths.
Got it. Yeah.
And then there are a couple of other layers to it, because we know that there was a kind of elite male rape culture sometimes, that men thought that they could be like the gods, they could be God equal, and the way to show that they were God equal was to have their way with women in imitation of the gods. And the extreme example of that would also then be the emperor. Caligula and probably Nero believed that to show the world that they were actually gods on earth, they should abduct and rape. And we have some remarkable stories attached to Caligula's life of him. He goes to a wedding on one occasion, and he abducts the bride before the marriage is complete, and treats the bride as his own wife.
It's like the ultimate power move, right? God's powerful, so you're doing the
ultimate form of kind of toxic masculinity, but all justified on the idea that, well, this is how the gods behave, so can we.
Right.
And so the hymn is really positioning Christ as a different kind of God, entirely different kind of God, and an entirely different kind of lover, maybe. Maybe what's going on, I argue what's going on is that there's a setup between this kind of violent erotic behavior and Christ's love for humanity, which is manifest in him giving himself completely in a life of service and then ultimately a life of death. So a different kind of love for humanity.
Yeah.
So that's how that fits in. It ties up with the philosophical thing, because the philosophers also criticized this unethical behavior of the gods. And so the hymn kind of finds common cause with the philosophers in their moral repugnation for that dimension of popular religion.
Yeah. That's really good. So in part of what, so he's using the form of shifting from the form of a god into the human form kind of thing, but the nature of God that's revealed in his shift, his kenosis, his emptying of himself and his giving, that reveals a completely different divine mode of being than people typically associated with the gods who just lord it over human beings and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm trying to remember this. I'm sure you probably mentioned it, but this would also maybe dovetail within some Jewish theology where the sons of God come down, we briefly mentioned in Genesis 6, more thoroughly in Enochic tradition, where the sons of God come down and rape the daughters of human beings. So that would be a kind of a Jewish parallel or so to what you're discussing.
Yes, that might have been. I think if we speculate on where this idea might have come from, the kind of prehistory of the hymn I think you can imagine that at an earlier phase, prior to the writing of the letter, there was some kind of contrast being thought about between Christ and the fallen watchers. Yeah, which is what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I was curious. Maybe I just throw one little side question in here, just out of curiosity. I don't recall, and I might have missed this, but I've always found the pattern of the hymn to, in some sense, to reflect the suffering servant of Isaiah. Do you see that there? I mean, you do argue, I think persuasively, that the primary mode of argumentation here is more philosophical, not as much just kind of direct scriptural language. Of course, in the exaltation scene, then we get the quotations from Isaiah, but I think it works really well with your argument of like the it's in the exaltation of the servant in the poem that they actually recognize truly who the servant was all along. Right. And I think that in terms of the pattern of the poem, of the hymn, it does in some way map onto that. So do you still see that there as being a part of it, or do you resist making that connection? Just maybe too many different moving parts.
Yeah, well, there's so much going on. I think in the hymn, there's not much room for anything else. But I think you could possibly argue, assuming this is a pre-Philippians hymn, if Paul were to cite it and to teach from it in a church with a strong Jewish contingent, he might have made that kind of connection. Mm-hmm. But an overarching argument for the whole of my book is that this letter is written to a community of Christ believers who are almost entirely, as far as we can make out, converts from a non-Jewish background. Mm-hmm. So for there to be connections to the suffering servant, you'd have to hypothesize that Paul has used this hymn with them before when he's made connections to Isaiah 53 and so on. And I just don't think in this letter, I can't see, there's nothing else in the rest of the letter to suggest that's what he wants. That's the kind of hermeneutical route that he's wanting for them to see. Okay.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I was just curious to hear your thinking on that. So can you talk to us about the statement of he's bestowed, this is in the exaltation piece now, as a result, right? There's the dia, so verse 9, the therefore, he's become obedient up until the point of death on a cross. Diakai, therefore God, he hyper exalts him. He greatly exalts him. I agree with you, by the way. I don't like the new NRSV. Yeah. Even I think that's reading into the verb beyond what is implied. An overall interpretation of what the translator thinks is going on in the whole thing. But so we'll say greatly exalts him and gifts him the name that is above all names. So you have a bit of a different take on what that name is. Yes. Kind of, I mean, building on, of course, this idea that the name entails Lord, the divine name, but there's more to it than that in your take. So what does Paul mean by that, or the writer of the hymn, and the name above all names? Yeah.
Okay. So there are in scholarship there have been three alternative options here. It either means kurios, either the name is kurios in the sense of Lord, but only in the sense that a king is Lord, the emperor is Lord. Probably most scholars have recently thought that it's Lord, but in the sense of Yahweh kurios, where kurios is a translation substitute for the divine name, mm-hmm. the Tetragrammaton. And one or two people have thought that the supreme name is Jesus. And you can make arguments for each of those three. Good arguments. but all share an anachronistic, false assumption. I argue that in our world, we associate status with simplicity of a name. So the fact that he's perhaps the best rock musician of our generation means that we just call him Bono. Mm-hmm. Does anyone know his real name, his full name?
Right.
We refer to them as Putin or Trump. Just a simple name.
Yeah.
But in the ancient world, the higher your status, the more names you would have, the more names and titles and epithets. So Roman citizens all have 3 names. Mm-hmm. Emperors had multi-part names. Now, if Paul is writing from Ephesus in the early 50s, then the emperor is his name is Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, and to that would be perhaps added the emperor's name would also have such titles as Pontifex Maximus, Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, and so on. So. And this is the way these guys are referred to in inscriptions and in letters and in official documents. So, high status name above all names. It's not going to be just Lord or just Jesus. Mm-hmm. And when we look carefully at the Greek of the second part of the hymn, I think the best way to translate it is not the way it's almost always translated in English translations, where you have something like. So at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord.
Yeah. I agree with you, by the way. I think the hot tea there is recitative. I've long thought that.
Oh, yeah. Have you? Yeah. Great. So I think that the hottie is not a that, it's a recitative. In other words, it's introducing a quotation. It's introducing the speech.
That is, the acclamation is just Lord Jesus Christ.
The acclamation is just Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Just the simple 3 Greek words, Kurios Jesus Christos. And that's the name above all names. Mm-hmm. The answer to the puzzle of what is the name above all names is staring
it's in verse 11. It's
in verse 11. Yeah. It's not hard to find. And so it's a multi-part name because it's a high status individual. It's a name which includes the name of God. The first part of the 3-part name is Kurios, and that stands for Yahweh. So, in a sense, the name above all names you might say is Yahweh Kurios, Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. That's who the protagonist is. Yahweh Kurios, Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So that's the simple, straightforward first part of my answer to the question. In another chapter, I go on to argue that there's a bit more to it than that. Shall I just quickly go through that part?
Yeah, please. I love it. Yeah.
Okay, so since it's a text which is in so many ways interacting with Greco-Roman culture, religion, politics, we ought to think about the way the Greek and Roman gods are named. And we today, of course, we opt for this simple form of a name as the default. We refer to Zeus or Aphrodite or Juno or Saturn. And sometimes the ancients did that too. But more often than not, they spoke about the gods in their particular manifestations with multi-part names. And we have well over 10,000 examples of this from letters, inscriptions, and papyri. Somebody's actually collected them all. And so the form would be something like Aphrodite of Paphos of good counsel, or Zeus, liberator, founder of the city. Mm-hmm. So there was a convention that those names illustrates where you speak of a deity in its particular manifestation, perhaps in association with a particular location. So Aphrodite of Paphos is Aphrodite as she was manifest and worshipped at Paphos on the island of Crete. Mm-hmm. Or you might, with these epithets and these added titles, pick out and draw attention to a particular attribute or function of the deity. So you might sing a hymn to Aphrodite Euploia, Aphrodite of fair voyage, if you're about to set sail and you want the goddess of love to protect you from the storms and possible shipwreck. So I argue that Yahweh Kurios Jesus Christ is a kind of three-part divine name that identifies the hymn's protagonist as the one God, Yahweh Kurios, in his particular manifestation as the human Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense, yeah.
It's summing up what's happened in the story so far.
Yeah.
The first half has talked about the human life, and the climax identifies that life as the life of the man Jesus.
Yeah.
And the Christos part also draws attention to his representative identity, the way in which he sums up all human life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he's not associated with a particular place, but with a particular biography.
Yeah, right. So we're getting the divine attribute, the Lord, and then the person who gets that title, who hasn't been mentioned by name in the narrative of the hymn, is being revealed kind of at the end. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's really fascinating. That also, I mean, I'm sorry to bring this back to Hebrews. Maybe it's just because I'm teaching a class on this right now, but that also maps on really interestingly with what Hebrews does, because Hebrews, you have the pre-incarnate being, the one who, and then at the end, now I think the name that it's given there is Son initially, not the angels, but the Son. But then you have him as Lord in the acclamation, in the exaltation. He's the Father recognizes the Son as Lord. And then he's not actually named as Jesus till later in chapter 2, when he's exalted, he's brought lower than the angels, as a particular reading of Psalm 8. And then it says, we don't currently see all things subordinated to him, but we do see Jesus crowned in glory and honor. And so it's like it kind of it gives you that same biography, and then it reveals the name Jesus after, right, and in the exaltation or whatever. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think there possibly is a common tradition underlying Hebrews chapters 1 and 2 and Philippians. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I like this. Okay, so bigger picture question then for you as we're getting closer to the end. What does the overall Christ hymn reveal about the relation of God the Father and Lord Jesus Christ? So if we're taking it to that big question of Christology, which I mean has animated a lot of your research and thinking, right? Like, what is this teaching us about the relationship of God to Jesus?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll try and do this as best I can. When you do all the hard work on the precise meaning of this Greek word, that Greek word, the syntax of each part of the hymn, and of course we've looked at several ways in which I proposed new or very rarely advocated views. When you do all the hard work of that, and in my book I do that over chapters 1 to 9 primarily.
A lot of spade work going on, yeah.
A lot of spade work. By the time I get to chapter 13, I try to cash that all out with a proposal that one thing the hymn's really doing, one of the ways in which it's really, for Paul the Jew, is really bold in its theological claims, is that it's celebrating the one God, and of course it includes a midrashic citation from Isaiah 45:23, a classic monotheistic text. It's claiming that the one God is now actually revealed in two persons, God the Father and Lord Jesus Christ, or Yahweh Kurios Jesus Christ. In fact, it might actually be best to call the hymn the Lord Jesus Christ and God the Father hymn, because really the sharp end of the theological burden of the hymn is to celebrate God as one and two. And there are some in that chapter 13, I kind of fleshed that argument out. Maybe it's helpful just to give a couple of examples.
Sure.
So the hymn proceeds in verse 6 from the divine characters and divine identity is really quite obscure. what does it mean to say that Christ is in the form of God? Which God? I mean, and the Greek could almost be translated in the form of agod, as in fact some recent commentators, Paula Fredrickson, for example, has argued. So theos in verse 6 is anarthrous. But then as the hymn progresses, there's a kind of filling out of the characterization of both the one who is eventually fully revealed as Lord Jesus Christ, and also filling out of the character of God the Father. It's a drama in which the way in which these two characters interact fully displays their identity. And so with God, it's theos without an article in verse 6, and then in verse 9 it's hotheos. So agod, maybe you could say agod, God, and then in the final line, God is God the Father. So there's a kind of, I use the word individuation. There's a revealing of the particular identity of God as ultimately God the Father, and simultaneously there's a progression through the passage in the identity of Kurios, or the one who is fully named as Yahweh Kurios, Jesus Christ, by the end. And as you pointed out earlier, Max, it's really significant that in the first half of the passage, the human one doesn't get a name. He's nameless. And that's significant because there are so many ways in which the hymn is kind of biographical or encomiastic, and you'd expect a name early on. The fact that there is no name, it kind of the implied reader, the implied audience is kind of waiting to be told who is this character. So it is a journey into personhood, into divine personhood, I think.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. Okay, this is really great stuff. The last question I want to ask you then is this. Obviously, I mean, this hymn is remarkable, but it's situated in this letter to serve certain rhetorical purposes as well, which is, I mean, if we just look at the context, right? Paul is very interested in them having the heart set, the mindset, of Christ. But you also argue that this way of reasoning, phronesis, it needs to be embedded with a way of being, right? So you reason in light of your nature, or who you are.
Yes.
And so, I'd just love to hear kind of your thoughts, your larger big picture thoughts on what this does for how we think of conformity of Christ, like how Paul is presenting that in the letter, that the nature that's revealed, the God manner of being, how that's revealed. What does conformity to that look like?
Okay, well, you've said it pretty well already yourself. I mean, I think one of the things that drove me early on in wanting to get to the bottom of so much that I tried to describe in the book, I was bugged by somebody. Somebody said, a well-known scholar said, of course, there can't be a connection for Paul between what Christ does in the beginning when he's in heaven and what Paul thinks believers in Philippi should be doing. So it's often said that the purpose of the hymn is a kind of imitation of Christ, an expectation that we should have this way of behaving. So he humbles himself. We should be humble-minded. He was obedient unto death. Paul asks the Philippians to continue to be obedient in 2:12. So there are definite connections between the human life of Christ and the life of the believer in their human lives in the present tense. But this scholar was saying that they were making an argument for why the hymn must be prior to the letter, because the argument went, well, it doesn't fit the letter. In verse 6, it doesn't fit the letter because that's talking about what Christ did prior to his, or in setting in motion his journey into the human world. And Paul can't possibly think that the behavior of the divine Christ is exemplary. It's only the behavior of the human Christ that is exemplary for Paul.
Yeah, got it.
And I was really bugged by this. And and so in the book I argue that actually there are various ways in which as you hinted in the way you framed your question, Max, that for Paul, it's for Paul, the believers, the call for the believer to be conformed to Christ. For Paul, the unpacking of what it is to be in Christ includes some sense of us behaving out of our shared identity with Christ, out of our participation in Christ's nature, out of our participation, our having Christ's heart set.
Mm-hmm.
And one theme that I unpack at one point is this idea that Paul, in the opening Thanksgiving, says to the Philippians, chapter 1, verse 8, God is my witness how I long for you all in the visceral affections of Christ Jesus, which is a very striking statement, and it tends to get short shrift in the commentators. But there it is right at the beginning of the letter, and I think it's kind of programmatic for the whole argument. I think what Paul is doing is he's setting himself up as a kind of mini. He's a chip off the Christ block in that he shares in Christ's. Well, in Christ's affections. I long for you, not I long to be with you. I long for you.
Yeah.
And I think he's tagging there what the hymn says, which is that Christ came to be with humans out of a visceral affection, out of a longing, out of a desire for humanity, which for Paul should shape us in our affections for each other, and which he shows by example has shaped his affections for his readers.
Yeah.
So it's a conformity, not just to the human behavior of Christ, but even to the divine psychology, to the divine nature, to the divine character, to everything. There's not really a part of Christ's person which, in this letter and in the way in which Paul unpacks the hymn, there's not really a part of Christ's identity that Paul says we're not to be conformed to. I mean, obviously, we don't have the form of Christ being in the form of God, but Paul thinks there is a deep connection between it all.
Yeah. So it fits kind of with the idea of theosis, sort of like we're becoming fully as he is.
Yes,
he became.
Certainly.
I mean, yeah. And then out of that we imitate, we model, we imitate the nature. Yeah. You had a section on empathy in the book. Last thing, and I'm not sure. Yeah, obviously you're in the UK. It's come to my attention in the US in some unfortunate, I would say fringe, but it's not fringe because these are like, there's a lot of power in these like ultra conservative right wing evangelical circles where empathy is now being labeled as toxic and feminine and dangerous. And I'm not sure if that's come over to the UK or not.
Oh, I'm aware.
You are? Okay.
Yeah,
So it's a very odd thing, but and you wrote this book before that became a thing, but what are your thoughts on that in light of what you have done on empathy in this book too?
Okay, well, I have empathy for those who don't like empathy. In all seriousness, if you're interested in the empathy part of the book, please make sure that you read the chapter on empathy, but also the last chapter where I come back to empathy, because I think it is complex. And so the basic gist of my argument is that for Paul, obviously he doesn't use the word empathy, but I think you can make a good argument that he cashes out what Christ does in the incarnation in terms of empathy. Mm-hmm. So Christ, if you like, steps into human shoes in the incarnation. And Paul himself, in the way that the strategy of his argument is partly one of empathy for his readers. Mm-hmm. And this is very strong in the first chapter or so. That if you look carefully at what Paul's doing, and I'm not the first to say this, even John Chrysostom says this way back in the first millennium, that Paul is anticipating. He's thinking himself into the shoes of his readers, and what he's writing is designed to help them knowing where they're coming from. knowing their desires as well as their pain and suffering. So the strategy is driven by empathy, which Paul, I think, has learnt out of his understanding of what happens with God becoming human. But he doesn't. Paul's empathy is not one which you might call collusive, or there's no codependency. There's no. He identifies with the suffering and the pain of the readers, but he calls them to something which sets them free from their perspective. Don't be troubled by those oppressing you. Here's why. So I understand you're troubled. I empathize with you, but here's my therapy for your anxiety. So there is both standing with, but there is also calling out of and challenge to. So I unpack that in a bit more technical detail in relation to different models of empathy. There are different kinds of empathy. If you look at the psychology of empathy, the philosophy of empathy, there's a lot of work being done on healthy and unhealthy empathy. And I think really what Paul's modeling for us in the letter is a healthy form of empathy.
That's good.
So maybe it has, which is all to say, I empathize with those who don't like empathy.
That's good. Yeah. Appreciate that so much. Thanks, Crispin, for this conversation. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add before we kind of wrap?
No, I mean, I'm often asked, Crispin, people often say to me, Crispin, this is a 1,000-page book. Could you give us a shorter version? And I do want to get to that, but I'm waiting for the responses from colleagues and readers. So, it's been great to chat to you, Max, and to hear your reaction. I'm keen to understand which bits fly and which bits maybe don't work quite so well. And if anybody has any serious problems in any of it, I'd love to hear. The book has a website which people can go to to contact me and get in touch.
That's great. I can post that. I can post that in the description too, so people can check that out. There'll be a link to the book as well. So,
great.
I'm as I shared with you before we jumped on recording, I'm really interested to see what the critical responses to the different parts of the argument, because it is such a big, bold thesis and proposal with massive implications, and you've done all the work of laying it out there, and so people can track your arguments. And we've got Greek grammar arguments, contextual arguments, philosophical arguments. So there's a lot going on here, and I think it'll be really interesting to see, to see the impact the book makes in the years to come. So thank you so much. Thank you. All right. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.